Hello. I hope everyone is having a nice Wednesday, vibing the usual, as always. I was thinking we're gonna have a very special discussion. So this isn't really a topic a lot of people talk about. Information is basically like, how are top players consistent? And there's a few like real reasons in it, right? Number one is basically that they're very familiar with a lot of the interactions, they've training mode it. Like typically it's a decent chunk of, if you're gonna be like, you know, playing against Milia, typically you'll know like what moves are jump cancelable, which enables you to be better for dealing with stuff like Bad Moon, understanding risk reward from those options, right? These things are very important. It's experience. Especially, I mean, this is something that they changed in Strive, right? Specifically for this reason. Every character could threaten Gatlings or like RPS at you if you didn't understand how their Gatlings work. When you play, you are giving information on how you play. I mean, that sounds obvious, right? Like you are playing, so of course they'll understand what you're doing from how you execute, right? And this is kind of an interesting concept to talk about for especially lower level players, because there comes a point when you're a lower level player, you improve by doing less rather than doing more. You're just like both sending it at each other and hoping it works. And that's not bad. That's actually crucial for improving, because you won't understand how things work unless you experience it, right? A lot of people tend to undervalue how important experience is. Like they're like, I won't do this because it's bad, or like, you know, I don't like playing against this character or playing this character because he's bad. You can learn things from anything as long as you're willing to have an open mind about it and use it for the future. Like what I was talking about last with psychology, a lot of people tie experience to success. If you play for 15 years, you'd probably assume that this person, or most people would probably assume of you, I should say, they would assume that you have a lot of experience and you're very good just because of the time frame. They don't know what you've been up to in the 15 years. You may play like once a week or something, like who knows. Now, to move on, so like let's say you are very aggressive. If I just leave it like this, it looks so bad. You are very aggressive. Typically, you don't mind trying to go for big reads regardless of risk reward. Your soul. Use Vortex a lot, Fafnir, random bandit bringers, because the return is good if you are correct. If you watch my fucking YouTube at all or my stream, you'll notice that I talk a lot about consistency, and that makes sense, right? Because I mean, consistency, I mean, that's what matters. That's why you keep seeing the same top players winning tournaments or like doing really, really well. So you may think like, oh yeah, this shit doesn't matter. Like who gives a fuck? Who cares if I do all this? If you're wrong, you could lose the game off it. Here's where we're gonna tie this all in. So information you can gain from them. They are probably impatient off this alone. But let's break down Vortex. I'd say like, you know, medium reward, high risk. So let's say your options here are Vortex or like run up far slash. Mostly low risk, right? There are exceptions, it depends on the matchup. Low reward, high reward on counter hit with me. Low risk on block. Basically, these options are both the sort of same. They force like interactions, but in different ways. If you were the type of player to represent these two options, it gives me a very obvious way of beating you. It's very simple. All I would do if you did these two things, if I press something preemptively, I would just do 2K, right? I would just do 2K or 2S or whatever. I'd do one of the two options that really would cover it for me, right? While also I'm still covering the other option, which makes this option much better, right? Run up far S. It's rare that a lot of players actually get past this sort of interaction because it's hard to understand, right? You have to process the fact that they're adapting to you, and you have to change your game plan as you're playing to adjust, right? To adapt. And that's not simple, right? It's not easy. They can tunnel vision. A lot of people, like in this sort of interaction, they will mistakenly complain about the matchup rather than the players. If your game plan starts at doing Vortex or run up far slash, for example, this is information I can use. This is information I can use that also tells me a lot about how you like to play. If you do this, right, this alone can be game losing information that you can give, right? Because if you will start out by playing RPS or like gambling with Vortex, I can usually assume that you're willing to take more gambles, regardless of what it is, right? Which means even excluding my adaptation, this interaction taught me you're probably willing to gamble more regardless of risk reward. Thus, I will lean more into playing defensive. And it's not a matter of my adaptation is bad. What we're going to talk about is this aspect of it, leaning into playing more defensive. We're going to bold this even. This is how you know this shit's for real. Usually, if someone plays in this way and I adapt, I assume they won't adapt to how to be my current option. We're gonna get real serious. Typically, as a top player, my experience is the more aggressive a player is, the less they have to adapt with, unless their aggression is enabled by defensive play. This is kind of what I was talking about, where when you're newer, you may just kind of do shit. You know what I mean? Like, you may not even really be thinking about what you're doing. You're just like, well, I just want to go ham. I'm not blocking. Didn't pay $60 to go fucking ham. You know what I mean? Like, understanding that and getting past it. Yeah, it's throwing rock. That's a good way to put it. You just throw rock. Eventually, you learn to throw paper. This is where it starts to get complicated. Right, and this is why I'm kind of struggling to discuss it. Players both adapt. It becomes like, it essentially will boil down to like, if we keep playing, it becomes interactions based on how we RPS and where we choose to gamble and how the other person adapts, right? There's a lot of ways that this can loop, but without experience, it's hard to really adapt. And that's not a problem. You can experiment with how you adapt, but typically how I would recommend improving and how to recommend kind of developing your playstyle is trying to lean more into being defensive. So defensive play, I refer to reacting, typically over-respecting, or in general, choosing safer options to disengage or just choose to play neutral in general. And this is kind of the core of what we're talking about here. When we talk about these sort of things, a lot of the time, there's not really much way to adapt further without implementing defensive options. If you represent more aggressive options, it's like Leo players, right? Leo players will typically DP backdash, like wake up 2D or some shit. Some players will do like run up throw, right? If you're right, like he can win the game off it, right? He can set play you. Let's say Leo does wake up 2D. You get set played, right? You still have a chance to win through him set playing. Leo does wake up 2D, you counter hit Leo, you almost kill him. Now you can see a direct difference between these two examples. Also with Kai, right? Kai runs full screen, full sprint, bloodshot eyes. He's trying to throw you. You know, you guys ever play Dead by Daylight? Like, he's basically Michael Myers. In this interaction alone, if he whiffs throw, you get a counter hit from him. If you hit him as he approaches, you get a regular hit. Now here's kind of the problem if you view these things so linearly. This is a great example of kind of why defensive adaptation is good. It's not always directly like playing defensive equals the best. It's typically more as an adaptation tool. Usually being defensive is very, very strong. What makes these good is it establishes them like that you're willing to do it. And this is something you can take advantage of. In my opinion, aggressive knowledge check tend to lean towards aggressive players. I would never do wake up 2D as Leo, right? Like just inherently. This wouldn't be my like layer 1, this would be like my layer like 4. This is information I can use, right? I'm gonna put this at the very top. In fact, in anime games, the default is typically very aggressive. If you think about it, not very many characters are rewarded for good defensive play. It's more like if you can use defensive play with your options, it adds on to how good your aggression is. Truthfully, for a lot of people, like let's say in towers, this is a great example of where it probably won't matter. What matters about this is that you are more willing to lean into aggressive playstyles. If you're willing to do that, that typically means that you're not as focused on risk reward. That's usually my train of thought, and that's what I've almost always done. That means if you are willing to continue to gamble or like RPS in all these ways, it makes playing defensive better. This is the end game goal as a fighting game player in general. No matter what the game is, the end game goal is you want rewards for doing nothing, right? This is basically the end game goal. Just inherently, by doing nothing, Like, let's say even if you block, you are not opening yourself up to risk. Inherently, like, you can win games by doing nothing. Some characters can just swing right back. Like, Soul is a great example because he's designed to win in RPS situations, right? Most of the time, though, if they're still willing to do things like Vortex, if this is a core part of your game plan, you need to reconsider it because it leans into this, and thus, essentially, people can beat you just by recognizing that you are willing to take that risk. This is where the problem of winning as a basis is kind of bad, because that means, like, again, you open yourself up to kind of poor expectations in the long term, especially as you grow. You do Vortex all the time, then you play Otashi round 1. You do Vortex to him, he laughs at you on stream, and he says, you know, this guy's a gamesman. And then he kills you, and you're just like, where the fuck did I go wrong? Naga's broken. Which sounds like obvious, like of course you should lose to better players, but this is essentially what makes them better. This comprehension can make them a better player than you. No matter how you adapt, right? As an offensive player, they always have the option of playing defensive, right? You can always just block. Especially newer players will be like, oh, blocking could get me fucking killed. Let's say in this interaction, one, this is information in itself. They're willing to do wake up buttons and commit, which means this gives us more information. They are Leo players. They are Leo. They are a Leo player. I'm gonna put that in bold. I mean, it doesn't matter if it hits or not. Basically, the fact that they do this gives us more information. Being overly dependent on one thing is almost worse than varying all your options in consistently, because the more predictable you are, the more that this matters. And this is where information matters so much, because a lot of people tend to have a preconceived notion on how a game should be played, how it should work. So let's say you may think oh well, blocking and strive sucks. You block once, you go die. Problem with it is that you have to block, and sometimes you're gonna have to block even to 100 risks, right? Just by nature of the game, and that fucking sucks. But that's a statement of matchups and stuff rather than the game itself. Usually make decisions not just on offense but around neutral and stuff like that, and that's usually the purpose of information. And it can still be fucking bad, but that's not a statement of how to play a game properly. It's usually just a matchup strategy thing. And this is kind of why, again, information is important, because you can still win bad matchups, obviously, right? Obviously. But what's important about it is you want to recognize where you can take advantage of their habits or what they show, what they tend to lean in towards. That's essentially the core part of it. No matter what aggressive option you choose, they will be punishable, or you make a big, commit. You could run full screen or whatever. If they block, you are in big dude. We're gonna keep it a little PG-13. I guess, I don't know if we can say that. How do you stabilize gameplay with characters like Slayer, where neutral, pressure, and Oki are all hinge on good reads and RPS? Well, he doesn't have to always commit, right? And this is kind of the important thing I want to talk about as well. Typically, as a top player, my experience is the more aggressive a player is, the less they have to adapt with, unless their aggression is enabled by defensive play. This is the key part. So even with characters like Slayer, if you watch, Daemendo is a great example, right? Daemendo is a perfect example, because he's very, very good with Slayer. But he would do things he'd throw you 4 times, and then he just crouch block and wait for you to do something, right? He uses the threat of an option to make you do something, and then he gets this, right? When it comes to meter, that changes things. When it comes to health, that changes things, right? This situation, when you have low health, Leo can he fucking vortexes you on his wake up, basically, right? If he just needs 1 hit, I mean, this shit sucks. But if you have full health and he doesn't, I mean, it changes things, right? I wish I had the clip, but Hotashi even talked about, and I agree with this, this is actually my playstyle decision against Leo in the past, is that they'll just RPS like this, I'll just choose the highest rewarding option, and if they adapt from that, I play around it, and I can still do that because of the nature of the options that they're choosing. Even if I don't end in super good Oki, or even if I do end in Super Kadoki, I may space myself just to play around, like, you know, maybe if they backdash, they won't get as good of a punish. But I may sacrifice like a bit of damage by doing, like, I don't know, Fire Slash, right? If you use like something to calculate how often I say a word on stream, risk reward is probably the highest. Well, maybe it's Moo at this point. Yesterday, you were playing a lot against a Amelia player who you said was trying to RPS in neutral too much against your Baiken and some other things. If you could remember the set, could you talk about it in the information of content and adaptation? Absolutely. And this is a very common way of playing around Baiken, but they would typically do things like IAD, empty jump, throw, or they would do like really late needs to cover parry. As an adaptation to this, I would just choose to do wake up close slash, right? This is specifically why I started doing that. Even on hits sometimes, I would mash out with close slash because they use jump H, air dash, jump H as an autopilot. Choosing close slash, I made it so I made risk reward, there's that word, way more in my favor while choosing the same sort of option for how they were playing. When you get into this bubble, like this is kind of what I would describe as forcing it. You do late option to beat parry, or you do throw, you media immediately, or even like that's it. Like just these two options alone. It incentivizes me to RPS with a stronger button because there's low risk when I'm wrong against Milia, right? Against Milia. Like she could knock me down, but they've proven already just from this information alone, they're pretty afraid of parry. I'd mash out with 5 feet, which is low reward, right? So this was a direct adaptation to how they chose to interact with me. If you RPS every time in this bubble, the character with the better reward options immediately will typically win long term in more of the percentage. The character with a better reward consistently will, I should say, usually win. There are some exceptions to this, right? Like there's a lot of things we can talk about from here. This is like, this sort of conversation in this bubble alone is hard to really discuss because it is not always equal, right? Like, so like a character like Ram, for example, could still win this, but it's not through direct reward. It's through how advantageous the situation that follows is, and that's for an entirely different reason than someone like Leo in terms of how she has to commit and where she chooses to commit and how she can loop it and the risk reward around it. There's a lot of things to talk about, and this is where it becomes more matchup stuff, but this is kind of the concept that I really think about. At the end of the day, the core is you want to be able to adapt to more defensively, because the risk reward inherently is less. I played Punk in a first to 10 like last year, right? Like right before like before Big Leffen's chonky tournament, and like I lost a set to him by playing a little too defensive, right? Like, and fundamentally, Punk is just a better player than me. So if I tried to play him fundamentally, I would lose, like just straight up. What I adapted with, like in the next day, we played in Big Levo. And what I chose to do was I gambled a lot more on deeper approaches when he tried to whiff punish me. So like I would do like really like run full screen and Fafnir sort of thing. I essentially forced interactions more often to avoid those things because he's just a better fundamental player than me. And that's like kind of like there's no one, what is it, like a one like size fits all. You know what I mean? It's basically, you have to alternate between these things, because if you lean into one thing and you give your opponent information on like, you know, oh, I want to, like I just want to down back in the center situation every time, that it becomes a liability. Right, so we had our little chat. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it was informative. PhD in fighting games. I got a PhD in being a cow.